Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now, let's start. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a prince in possession of a private journal must be in want of better security for his innermost thoughts. This particular truth would become painfully evident to His Royal Highness Prince Quentin Stanton of Westmoreland, third son of King George III, cousin and 17th in line to the British throne, a position just prestigious enough to warrant invitations to all the finest events of the season, yet sufficiently removed from actual governance to allow for a life of leisure and, dare I say, the occasional indiscretion. The London season of 1814 had begun with its usual flurry of balls, musicales, and garden parties, where ambitious mammas paraded their daughters before the tun like prized mares at Tattersall's. The weather, as is its custom in England, had been abysmal, rain pelting down with such determination that even the most dedicated followers of fashion were forced to consider practicality over appearance. A circumstance that, I assure you, caused no small amount of distress among the modistes of Bond Street. I simply cannot understand why the Almighty would choose to rain upon the very night of Lady Harthington's ball, lamented Mrs. Olivia Oberlin, a widow of comfortable means and mother to 4 daughters, the eldest of whom stood beside her, looking far less concerned with the weather than her mother. How a gentleman to admire your new gown if it's hidden beneath a pelisse? Perhaps they might admire my conversation instead, replied Miss Penelope Oberlin with a quirk of her brow that suggested such a radical notion might not be entirely in jest. Oh, Penny! Her mother fluttered her handkerchief dramatically. Conversation does not secure proposals, my dear. Beauty and accomplishments do. Then I am thoroughly doomed, Penelope replied, though the looking-glass betrayed her modesty. At 22, Miss Oberlin possessed the sort of beauty that improved upon acquaintance, intelligent hazel eyes, a complexion that had survived the teenage years with minimal rebellion, and chestnut hair that curled with enthusiastic disobedience at the first hint of humidity. She was neither the diamond of the season nor a wilting wallflower, rather, she occupied the dangerous middle territory of being interesting, which in the marriage mart is often considered a liability rather than an asset. The tun, you see, prefers its young ladies to be predictable, like properly brewed tea or the trajectory of a billiard ball struck by a gentleman who has not yet overindulged in brandy. Miss Oberlin, unfortunately, was more akin to a game of chance where the dice have been subtly weighted. Lady Harthington's ball, despite the inclement weather, proceeded with all the expected pageantry. The ballroom glittered with candlelight reflecting off the jewels of the aristocracy, the air heavy with expensive perfume designed to mask the less pleasant realities of bodies in motion. The orchestra played a selection of country dances and waltzes, the latter still considered slightly scandalous by the more conservative matrons who nevertheless allowed their daughters to participate with carefully monitored enthusiasm. It was during the third set that whispers began to circulate through the ballroom like ripples in a pond after a particularly large stone has been dropped. "He's here," hissed Miss Latterly to her companion. "Prince Quentin has arrived." Indeed, standing at the entrance to the ballroom was the prince himself, his tall figure immediately recognizable. At 28, Prince Quentin had cultivated the precise degree of fashionable ennui required of a gentleman of his station. His cravat was tied in a mathematical feat that had reduced his valet to tears of pride, his coat of midnight blue fitting his broad shoulders as though it had been painted on by an artist with a particular fondness for male anatomy. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, was artfully tousled in a way that suggested both adherence to and dismissal of current fashion, a contradiction that only the truly elite could successfully navigate. "He looks bored already," remarked Penelope to her younger sister Lydia. "How can you tell?" Lydia asked, craning her neck for a better view. "His left eyebrow is slightly raised," Penelope replied. "A clear indication that he is mentally calculating how quickly he can make a socially acceptable exit." "You cannot possibly know that from an eyebrow," Lydia protested. "I can and I do," said Penelope with a smile. "I've made a study of expressions. They tell far more truth than words, which are notoriously unreliable." "You should write a book," Lydia suggested. "And scandalize Mamma beyond recovery?" "I think not." Their conversation was interrupted as Lady Harthington herself swept toward the prince, curtsying deeply before leading him into the ballroom. What followed was the customary procession of eligible young ladies being presented to His Royal Highness, each one dropping into a curtsy so precise it might have been measured with mathematical instruments. Penelope observed this parade with the clinical detachment of a naturalist studying an exotic species. The prince, for his part, performed his duty with the mechanical politeness of a well-wound clockwork figure, bowing and offering the expected compliments with neither excessive enthusiasm nor noticeable disdain. It was only when Lady Harthington guided him toward the refreshment table, where, by pure coincidence that would make even the most amateur novelist blush, Penelope happened to be standing, that the evening took its first unexpected turn. "Miss Oberlin," Lady Harthington said, "may I present His Royal Highness, Prince Quentin Stanton of Westmoreland." "Your Highness, Miss Penelope Oberlin." Penelope executed a perfect curtsy, having practiced the movement until her knees threatened to organize a formal protest. "Your Highness, Miss Oberlin." The prince bowed, his expression unchanged from the previous 20 introductions, until his gaze properly fell upon her face. His left eyebrow, which had indeed been slightly raised, now joined its companion in a brief moment of surprise before settling back into aristocratic composure. "I believe we've met before," he said. This was, dear listener, an outright falsehood. Penelope Oberlin had never been introduced to the prince, a fact she knew with absolute certainty. Yet social protocol prevented her from contradicting a royal personage, particularly in such a public setting. "I fear your highness must be thinking of someone else," she said with diplomatic caution. "I never forget a face," he insisted. "Then I must have one of those unfortunate countenances that resembles many others," Penelope replied. "A blessing for portraitists who need not be particularly precise, but a curse for unique identification." The prince's mouth twitched, an infinitesimal movement that most would have missed. "Do you always speak in such paragraphs, Miss Oberlin?" "Only when contradicting royalty, your highness. It requires additional words to cushion the impertinence." Lady Harthington's horrified gasp could have extinguished several nearby candles. The prince, however, did something entirely unexpected. He laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that caused nearby conversations to stutter into silence. "Well played, Miss Oberlin," he said. "I concede the point. We have not met before. I would remember not just your face, but such refreshing honesty." And so began the first of several encounters between Prince Quentin and Miss Oberlin during that season. Their paths crossed at the Countess of Ellesmere's musicale, where Penelope declined to perform. "My skills at the pianoforte are best suited for empty rooms, your highness, preferably with locked doors to prevent escape," and again at Lady Fortescue's garden party, where they found themselves sheltered under the same tree during an unexpected shower. "We must stop meeting like this, Miss Oberlin," the prince remarked as raindrops pattered on the leaves above them. "Indeed, your highness. People will talk. They'll say I've mastered the art of weather prediction solely to engineer these encounters." "And have you?" "If I possessed such talents, I assure you I would have conjured sunshine instead. My bonnet is new." The prince studied said bonnet with exaggerated seriousness. "It's very blue." "Your powers of observation do credit to the royal bloodline," Penelope replied, fighting a smile. What neither of them observed, however, was the keen attention their conversations had attracted from the ton's most dedicated gossips. Lady Whistledown's society papers devoted an entire paragraph to their animated discussion at Viscount Pembroke's dinner party, while elderly Lady Danbury was overheard remarking that the prince had danced with Miss Oberlin twice at the Featherington ball, a clear indication of preference or madness, and the boy has always seemed reasonably sane. Mrs. Oberlin, upon learning of her daughter's repeated interactions with royalty, vacillated between ecstasy and terror. "A prince, Penelope! But you must guard your tongue. Your wit will be the death of your prospects." "My wit is the only thing keeping me awake during these endless social functions," Penelope replied. "Besides, His Highness seems entertained by it." "Men wish to be admired, not entertained," her mother insisted. "They keep spaniels and jesters for entertainment. They keep wives for adoration and heirs." Penelope wisely refrained from pointing out the unflattering comparison. Prince Quentin, meanwhile, found himself in the unusual position of anticipating social events he had previously endured with stoic resignation. His cousin, the Duke of Ravenscroft, noticed the change. "You've attended every event this season," the Duke remarked one evening at White's, where they sat nursing glasses of brandy. "I cannot recall you showing such dedication to social obligation since your mother threatened to cut your allowance after the incident of '09. "We agreed never to speak of that," Quentin replied, swirling his brandy with unnecessary vigor. "Indeed we did. Just as we agreed you would accompany me to Bath last week, yet you remained in London for Lady Harthington's insipid soirée. The weather was unfavourable for travel." "The weather was perfection." "You, however, had heard that a certain Miss Oberlin would be in attendance." Quentin's expression remained carefully neutral. "I find her conversation stimulating." "I find brandy stimulating, yet I don't rearrange my calendar for it," the Duke countered. "Though perhaps I should. It's certainly less dangerous than whatever game you're playing with that young lady." "There is no game." "Then there should be no objection to your joining me at my country estate next week. The fishing is excellent this time of year." The prince hesitated just long enough to confirm his cousin's suspicions. "Good God, Quentin! You're smitten." "I am nothing of the sort. Miss Oberlin is simply one of the few people in society capable of constructing sentences containing actual thoughts rather than regurgitated platitudes. She's also unmarried, reasonably pretty, and completely unsuitable for someone in your position." "My position," Quentin reminded him, "is 17th in line to a throne I have no interest in occupying." "Nevertheless, your mother expects a match with someone of appropriate breeding. Lady Cecilia Montague, perhaps, or the Earl of Westham's daughter. Both of whom have the personality of underdone toast." "Toast doesn't talk back or cause scandals," the Duke pointed out. "An excellent point. Perhaps I should propose to a bakery." The Duke sighed with the resignation of a man who recognized a lost cause when confronted with one. "Just be careful, cousin. The Tun loves nothing more than a royal scandal, except perhaps the downfall that follows." Had Prince Quentin heeded this advice, dear listener, our story might have taken a very different turn. But fate, or more accurately, a summer thunderstorm of biblical proportions, had other plans. The storm in question arrived during Lady Worcester's country house party, an event that had drawn much of London society to the rolling hills of Hampshire. The guest list included no less than 2 dukes, an earl, countless minor nobility, and, by virtue of Lady Worcester's distant connection to the royal family, Prince Quentin himself. Miss Oberlin and her mother had received an invitation through the influence of Mrs. Oberlin's cousin, who had once been Lady Worcester's lady's maid before making an advantageous match with a prosperous merchant. The first 2 days of the house party proceeded without incident, filled with the usual activities, archery competitions where gentlemen admired ladies' form with barely disguised appreciation, picnics where aunts demonstrated their excellent taste by targeting the most expensive dishes, and evening card games where fortunes changed hands with deceptive casualness. Prince Quentin and Miss Oberlin maintained a careful distance, their interactions limited to polite nods across drawing rooms and brief exchanges of pleasantries in passing. This restraint was noted with disappointment by those who had hoped for more entertaining developments and with relief by Mrs. Oberlin, who had spent the journey to Hampshire lecturing her daughter on the importance of dignity and reserve. "A gentleman's interest wanes when the chase lacks challenge," she had insisted. "Then perhaps we should release a fox in the drawing room," Penelope had replied. "I'm sure that would provide sufficient challenge for everyone." On the 3rd evening, the heavens opened with dramatic enthusiasm. Rain lashed against the windows of Lady Worcester's manor house, transforming the manicured grounds into miniature lakes and forcing the entire party indoors. Lady Worcester, ever resourceful, declared it an excellent opportunity for charades and impromptu performances. "Nothing brings people together like forced theatrical displays," Penelope murmured to her mother, who responded with a sharp elbow to the ribs. As the evening progressed and guests took turns embarrassing themselves for the entertainment of others, Penelope slipped away from the crowded drawing room. The storm had triggered a headache, and she sought the quiet sanctuary of Lady Worcester's library, rumoured to contain one of the finest collections in the county. The library was blessedly empty and lit only by a small fire in the grate. Rows of leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines gleaming softly in the firelight. Penelope inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of paper and binding glue that she found infinitely more appealing than the perfumed crush of the drawing room. She wandered among the shelves, trailing her fingers along the book spines, occasionally pulling one out to examine its contents. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a leather armchair, she discovered a small writing desk. Upon it lay a leather-bound journal, its pages open as if recently abandoned. Curiosity, that most dangerous of traits in both cats and young ladies, compelled her to step closer. She had no intention of reading private correspondence, of course. She merely wished to see if it was a published work she might recognize. A flash of lightning illuminated the page, revealing handwriting rather than print. Penelope immediately stepped back, but not before her eyes caught a phrase that froze her in place. Miss Oberlin's eyes contain more intelligence than the combined libraries of Oxford. It was, unmistakably, about her. Propriety dictated she walk away immediately. Curiosity suggested a closer look. In the battle between these opposing forces, curiosity emerged victorious, as it often does when one's own name appears in unexpected places. Penelope leaned forward, careful not to touch the journal, and read, "Miss Oberlin continues to occupy my thoughts with alarming regularity. Today at breakfast, when Lady Worcester mentioned Wordsworth's latest publication, I found myself wondering what Miss O would make of it. Her literary opinions, like all her thoughts, are refreshingly direct and unfettered by conventional wisdom. Yesterday during the archery competition, when she split her arrow, purely by accident, she claimed, though I suspect otherwise, her look of surprise followed by triumph was so charming I nearly embarrassed myself by applauding like an enthusiastic schoolboy rather than maintaining royal decorum. Ravenscroft warns me that my attention to her will spark talk. He fails to understand that the talk has already begun, not because of any impropriety on either part, but because society cannot comprehend a relationship based on intellectual appreciation rather than strategic advancement. The truth, which I can confess only to these pages, is far more dangerous than any rumor the tongue might conjure. I am falling hopelessly into home. The sound of a throat being cleared with deliberate significance caused Penelope to straighten so quickly she nearly toppled backward. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by another convenient flash of lightning, was Prince Quentin himself. "Your Highness," she gasped, dropping into a curtsy that was more panic than protocol. "I was just reading my private journal," he finished for her, crossing the room with measured steps. His expression was unreadable, though a muscle twitched along his jawline. "I didn't know it was yours," she said, then winced at the obvious falsehood. "That is, I didn't initially realize it was private. Then I saw my name and," she stopped, recognizing that each word was digging her grave deeper. The prince reached the desk and closed the journal with a decisive snap. Most people, upon discovering they've stumbled upon private thoughts, have the decency to look away. Most people don't discover themselves as the subject of said private thoughts, Penelope countered, her initial embarrassment giving way to indignation. It's rather disconcerting to find oneself discussed in absentia. More disconcerting than having one's personal reflections invaded. Equally disconcerting, I should think. A perfect matched set of social transgressions. The prince stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from anger to something more complex. "You are the most vexing woman of my acquaintance, Miss Oberlin. So your journal suggested, though in more flattering terms." A reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. "You read quite a bit of it, then." "Only the part about me," she admitted. "Though I confess, I'm curious about how that particular sentence was going to end." The atmosphere in the room changed then, the air between them charged with something beyond the storm's electricity. Prince Quentin took a step closer, close enough that Penelope could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight stubble darkening his jaw where his evening shave had begun to fade. "Which sentence would that be?" he asked, his voice lower than before. "The one about falling," she said, her own voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, it seemed he might tell her. His eyes, dark in the firelight, searched her face as if seeking permission or perhaps courage. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back. "I think we've both engaged in enough impropriety for one evening, Miss Oberlin. Disappointment washed over her, though she masked it with a nod. Of course. I should return to the drawing room before my absence is noted. As should I. Neither moved. Rain pounded against the windows, punctuated by rumbles of thunder that seemed to echo the unspoken tension in the room. Penelope knew she should leave, that every moment alone with the prince in such circumstances risked her reputation and, more dangerously, her heart. Instead, she took a deep breath and spoke the words that would indeed change everything. Your Highness, I believe in addressing uncomfortable truths directly, so here is one. You were writing that you are falling in love with me. The prince's expression froze in shock. Furthermore, she continued, her voice steadier than she felt, I should inform you that if you were to complete that sentence in the affirmative, I would be forced to tell you that I return the sentiment with equal measure of both hope and trepidation. Trepidation, he echoed, seeming to find his voice. You are a prince. I am the daughter of a gentleman of modest means. Society would deem such a match unsuitable. Your family would likely object. Mine would die of collective apoplexy, though in my mother's case, it would be from joy rather than dismay. Prince Quentin's stunned expression slowly transformed into something warmer. You've given this considerable thought. I excel at considering impossibilities, Penelope replied. It's a talent that serves no practical purpose yet occupies an inordinate amount of my time. The prince closed the distance between them once more, this time taking her hands in his. What if it were not impossible? Then I would have to find another mental occupation. Perhaps calculating the exact number of disapproving stares we would receive at Almack's. He laughed, the sound warm and intimate in the quiet library. You truly are extraordinary, Penelope Oberlin. So your journal suggested. My journal, he said, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms, fails to capture even a fraction of your remarkable character. Your intelligence, your wit, your unfailing honesty, which has landed me in trouble on numerous occasions. And your modesty, clearly, he continued with a smile. From our first meeting, when you dared contradict me, a grievous social error. I knew you were unlike anyone I had ever met. Penelope looked down at their joined hands, then back up to his face. Are you completing that sentence from your journal, Your Highness? Quentin, he corrected gently. And yes, I am falling hopelessly in love with you, Penelope Oberlin. In fact, I believe I've already fallen, with all the grace of a man tumbling down a flight of stairs. That's not a very romantic metaphor, she pointed out, even as her heart threatened to beat its way out of her chest. Would you prefer something about stars or flowers? I can compose something suitably poetic if you insist. No, she said, squeezing his hands. I prefer honesty to poetry. And honestly, I've fallen too, though perhaps with slightly more dignity. What happened next, dear listener, would have caused Lady Whistledown to require smelling salts and Mrs. Oberlin to faint dead away. Fortunately for all parties involved, the library door remained closed, the storm continued to rage outside, and the guests in the drawing room were thoroughly engrossed in Lord Pembroke's dramatic rendition of the Charge of the Light Brigade. The kiss, for that is indeed what transpired, was both brief and profound, a perfect crystallization of the connection that had been building between them since their first meeting. When they parted, both wore expressions of wonder and certainty. I should have asked permission, the prince said, though he didn't look particularly regretful. I should have required it, Penelope replied, equally unrepentant. What happens now? He asked, still holding her hands as if afraid she might disappear. In novels, this would be where we declare our undying love, overcome a series of increasingly dramatic obstacles, and eventually marry amid general rejoicing. And in reality? Penelope considered this with the seriousness it deserved. In reality, I believe we must face the music in the drawing room before our absence sparks even more scandal than your journal revelations. He laughed and offered his arm. Ever practical, Miss Oberlin. Very well, let us face the music together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of gossip, speculation, and diplomatic negotiations worthy of the Congress of Vienna. Prince Quentin officially requested permission to court Miss Oberlin, a formality that caused Mr. Oberlin, who has been conspicuously absent from our narrative due to his preference for his study over society, to drop his pipe and Mrs. Oberlin to require actual smelling salts rather than the figurative ones we earlier imagined for Lady Whistledown. The ton's reaction ranged from outraged disbelief to romantic approval, with most opinions falling somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. Lady Danbury declared it the most sensible match I've seen in 30 years, while the Countess of Ellesmere sniffed that it was exactly the sort of misalliance one expects from the younger royal branches. Prince Quentin's mother, the formidable Duchess of Westmoreland, arrived in London with the force of an invading army, determined to assess the young lady who had captured her son's heart. Their first meeting, held in the formal drawing-room of the Oberlins' London home, was observed with breathless anticipation by Mrs. Oberlin, who had spent 3 days preparing for the occasion and still felt woefully unprepared. "Your Grace," Penelope curtsied with perfect form, meeting the Duchess's sharp gaze without flinching. "Miss Oberlin." The Duchess examined her as one might inspect a horse before purchase. "I understand you have bewitched my son." "I assure you, Your Grace, no supernatural abilities were employed. Merely conversation." HMPH, conversation rarely captivates men so thoroughly. "Perhaps Your Grace has been conversing with the wrong gentleman." A dangerous moment of silence followed this remark, during which Mrs. Oberlin nearly fainted again. Then, miraculously, the Duchess's stern countenance cracked into the barest hint of a smile. "Quentin warned me about your tongue. I hope he also mentioned its accompanying brain, which exercises strict governance over said tongue." Most of the time," the Duchess repeated. "Well, at least you're honest about your shortcomings." "I find it saves time, Your Grace. People discover them eventually anyway." By the end of the visit, the Duchess had not given her explicit blessing, but she had invited Penelope to take tea with her the following day, without her mother, a sign interpreted by society as tentative approval. 3 months after the incident in Lady Worcester's library, on a crisp autumn day when London was caught between summer's last gasp and winter's first whisper, Prince Quentin escorted Miss Oberlin through the gardens of St. James's Park. Their courtship had progressed with remarkable smoothness, owing largely to Penelope's ability to charm even the most skeptical members of royal society and Quentin's unwavering determination to have her as his wife. They paused beside the lake, watching ducks cut elegant paths across the water's surface. "I have something for you," the prince said, reaching into his coat. "If it's bread for the ducks, I must point out that they appear perfectly capable of fending for themselves. Rather like me. It's not bread." He withdrew a small leather-bound journal, identical to the one she had discovered at Lady Worcester's house party. "This is for you." Penelope accepted it with a puzzled expression. "Your journal?" "A new one," he clarified. "Open it." Inside, on the first page, written in his now familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Penelope, who read my heart before I had fully written it down." The rest of these pages are blank, awaiting the story we will write together. When she looked up, eyes bright with unshed tears, he was kneeling before her, heedless of the path's gravel. "Penelope Oberlin, you have changed my world with your honesty, your intelligence, and your courage. You found me when I didn't know I was lost and spoke truths I needed to hear. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife, my princess, my partner in all things?" Onlookers who happened to witness this scene, and there were several, as royal proposals in public parks tend to attract attention, would later report that Miss Oberlin's response was immediate and emphatic. What they could not hear was her whispered addition, "Though I must warn you, I may occasionally read over your shoulder. Old habits and all that." "I'm counting on it," he replied as he slipped the ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, onto her finger. "After all, if you hadn't read my journal, we might still be exchanging pleasantries at soirees." "A fate worse than death," she agreed, allowing him to help her to her feet. "Almost as bad as underdone toast," he said with a private smile. Their wedding, held the following spring in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, was declared the event of the season. The bride wore blue, a nod to that bonnet, the groom explained to confused guests, and the Duchess surprised everyone by shedding actual tears during the ceremony. Lady Whistledown's society papers devoted an entire issue to the celebration, noting that the unlikely romance between Prince Quentin and the former Miss Oberlin proves that even in our stratified society, true affection may occasionally transcend rank. One can only hope that the princess's refreshing forthrightness is not entirely subdued by royal protocol. Those who knew the couple well, however, had no such concerns. As the Duke of Ravenscroft remarked to Lady Danbury during the wedding breakfast, protocol doesn't stand a chance against her. And my cousin wouldn't have it any other way. In the years that followed, the Prince and Princess of Westmoreland became known for their philanthropic work, their literary salon that welcomed talents regardless of social standing, and their obviously devoted marriage. They filled journals with their shared experiences, their growing family, 3 children each with their mother's wit and their father's charm, and their unwavering belief that the most important stories are those written together. And if, occasionally, the princess was caught reading over her husband's shoulder as he wrote in his journal, well, that was simply where their story had begun.